Ever look up at something ancient and just think, wow, how did they even manage that?
Happens all the time, doesn't it?
It really does. And what if the story we've been told isn't the only one out there?
Hmm.
Welcome, everyone, to the Deep Dive. This is where we take a whole stack of sources on a topic and, well, we boil them down into the knowledge you really need to get what's going on.
And today, we're diving deep for you, the learner, into a book that definitely made some waves. Erich von Däniken's Chariots of the Gods.
That's the one. Our mission today is basically to explore some of those really big claims that got everyone talking about, ancient mysteries, UFOs, and see how they stack up when we look at them through more of an archaeological and scientific lens.
It's actually incredible to think about the impact that book had when it first landed. It was huge, a massive bestseller.
Right.
Suddenly, it felt like everyone was debating ancient civilizations, UFOs, whether history was really as straightforward as we'd all assumed.
Yeah, it really tapped into something.
And our sources point out it arrived at a really interesting moment. There was this growing skepticism towards, established authority, institutions. And at the same time, this massive excitement about space travel, technology, the future. People were, I think, genuinely open to new ideas, even really out there ones.
Exactly. People seemed hungry for answers that felt, I don't know, bigger.
Yeah.
More exciting than the standard explanations.
Yeah.
And Chariots of the Gods just delivered that in spades, didn't it? Challenging the conventional wisdom, suggesting these wild possibilities that really tied into the whole space age vibe.
It absolutely did.
So today we've got excerpts from analysis looking at the book and also some direct quotes from Chariots itself. So we get both sides.
A good mix. Should be interesting.
Okay, ready to jump in. Let's start with maybe one of von Däniken's most iconic claims.
Yeah.
The Nazca Lines.
Oh,
And through.
Yes, Nazca. Certainly iconic. Von Däniken put forward this really sensational idea, didn't he? That these enormous patterns etched into the desert floor were actually, well, ancient airfields.
Landing strips for aliens, basically.
Landing strips, exactly. For alien spacecraft. And later on, he even suggested some of the figures themselves, the animal shapes and things, were depictions of extraterrestrials.
Wow. That's quite a leap.
It's a claim that definitely put Nazca on the global map, for better or worse.
And when we dig into the analysis we have, it looks like this claim runs into some problems pretty quickly. For instance, the analysis points out he wasn't quite accurate in describing the famous bird figure, misinterpreted a feature as something like a modern airport structure.
Yeah, that description was flawed. So, okay, what is the generally accepted explanation then, archaeologically speaking?
Good question. What does the archaeology tell us?
Well, the Nazca Lines are actually this huge complex. We're talking over 800 straight lines, maybe 300 geometric shapes, and around 70 biomorphs. Those are the animals and plants you see.
70 of them. Wow.
Yeah, and they were created by the Nazca culture, probably between, say, 500 BC and 500 AD. And the really fascinating thing, maybe the most surprising thing, is how simple the construction actually was.
Simple. How so?
They basically just removed the dark reddish-brown pebbles covering the desert surface, just swept them aside, and that revealed the lighter-colored clay soil underneath.
So they're like shallow trenches?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Really shallow, only about 10 to 15 centimeters deep in most places.
Okay, simple technique. But for designs so massive, you really need to be airborne to see them properly. That sounds almost counterintuitive.
It does, doesn't it?
So how do we know it wasn't some kind of advanced tech or, help from above, like von Däniken suggested?
Well, a couple of things. Archaeological digs have actually found wooden stakes at the ends of some of these lines.
Ah, like survey markers.
Precisely. Strongly suggests they were using basic surveying methods to lay out these huge designs. And maybe even more compelling is the work done by people like Joe Nickel. He did experimental archaeology.
What did that involve?
He and his team basically set out to see if they could recreate some of these large figures using only simple tools and planning techniques that the Nazca people would have had available.
And could they?
They absolutely could. They showed you could make large, complex figures accurately in a relatively short amount of time without needing any aerial view or advanced technology.
Yeah.
It really undermines that whole needed help from the sky argument.
Okay, so the method was simple, replicable.
Yes. And we also can't forget the environment there. It's incredibly dry. That arid climate has been absolutely crucial in just preserving these lines, these shallow trenches, for centuries.
Right, preservation is key. So if they weren't alien runways,
Yeah.
what was the point for the Nazca people? Why create these enormous geoglyphs?
Yeah, that's the big question, and the exact purpose is still debated among archaeologists. But the alien airfield idea, that has zero scientific support. It's just not taken seriously.
So what are the serious theories?
Well, the leading ideas focus on their role within Nazca society, their beliefs, their needs.
Hmm.
Early researchers like Paul Kosak and especially Maria Reiche, who dedicated her life to them,
Uh-huh.
they suggested astronomical or calendrical functions, maybe aligning with the sun or stars at important times of the year.
Okay, like a giant calendar.
Sort of. Others have proposed the animal figures might represent constellations, or maybe counter-constellations, in the dark parts of the Milky Way. More recent research, though, points quite strongly towards a connection with water.
Water in a desert. That makes sense.
Exactly. Water and fertility rituals. Hugely important in such a dry place. Some think the lines might have been ritual pathways, processional routes, maybe leading to important ceremonial centers like Kawachi nearby.
So people would walk along them?
Possibly. Or maybe they delineated sacred spaces. Even the types of animals depicted, some are exotic birds not native to that desert area. That might suggest a connection to rain or distant fertile lands, perhaps used in rituals.
Wow. So it's not just lines, it's this really complex symbolic landscape tied into their survival, their spirituality.
Absolutely. Deeply interwoven with their fundamental needs and beliefs. It's a world away from just being a landing strip.
A much richer story, actually. And it's important to remember UNESCO designated them a World Heritage Site precisely because they testify to those pre-Columbian magical religious traditions, right? Not because of aliens.
Exactly. UNESCO's designation highlights their genuine cultural significance. And it's kind of ironic, von Däniken brought them global fame, which was maybe good in one way,
Yeah.
but his interpretations really overshadowed their true meaning. And that fame led to a huge surge in tourism, which actually started to damage the fragile lines.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it required massive conservation efforts, led mostly by Maria Reiche, to try and protect them. Some archaeologists later even expressed regret that the academic community maybe wasn't vocal enough early enough in strongly refuting von Däniken's claims.
Interesting how a compelling story, even if it's inaccurate, can have such real-world consequences.
It really is. Now, should we pivot to another huge example? One that von Däniken tackles head-on and is still debated constantly.
Let me guess. Egypt. The pyramids.
Yeah, got it. The
Yeah.
pyramids of Giza.
Classic ancient mystery territory. And von Däniken's angle here is basically questioning how the ancient Egyptians could possibly have quarried, moved, and lifted those ridiculously heavy stone blocks
Multi-ton blocks, yeah.
up to those incredible heights without some kind of advanced tech that just seems way beyond what we think they had.
Exactly. That's a cornerstone of his argument for Giza. And look, the sheer scale of the pyramids is undeniably mind-blowing, no question.
Right. You stand there and it's just, wow.
But the archaeological and engineering evidence actually gives us a pretty detailed picture. It shows construction through human ingenuity and, crucially, a highly organized workforce.
Okay, so break it down. How did they do it, according to the evidence? Materials first.
Okay, the main material was limestone, mostly quarried right there on the Giza Plateau, very nearby. Some of the granite for interior chambers and things came from further away, down south in Aswan.
And getting it out of the ground, quarrying.
We see clear tool marks. They indicate copper tools, chisels, saws probably used with an abrasive like wet sand to cut through the stone. Also heavy stone pounders, wooden levers, pretty basic but effective tools.
Okay, basic tools. But moving blocks that weigh as much as several cars, that still sounds like the really hard part.
Definitely a major challenge. Transport was likely done using large wooden sledges. Think big sleds.
Okay.
And these were dragged over specially prepared roadways or causeways, probably made of packed clay or taffla, maybe even lubricated with water poured in front of the sledge to reduce friction.
Like wetting the path.
Exactly. And we've actually found physical remains of some of these causeways leading up to the pyramids.
Ah, okay, so evidence for the transport routes exists. What about the lifting? Getting them up the pyramid itself, that seems impossible.
That's where the ramp theory comes in. It's the most widely accepted explanation.
Right, ramps, I've heard of that.
Now, the exact type of ramp, whether it was one long straight one or maybe zigzagging up a face or even spiraling around the pyramid as it grew, that's still debated among Egyptologists.
So we don't know the exact design.
Not for sure at Giza itself, but we have very strong supporting evidence now. A really significant discovery was made relatively recently at an alabaster quarry called Hatnub.
Hatnub.
Yeah, they found a 4,500-year-old ramp system there. And crucially, it dates right back to the time of Khufu, the pharaoh who built the Great Pyramid.
Wow. So contemporary evidence. What was this ramp like?
It was pretty sophisticated. It had a very steep central ramp, flanked by staircases on either side, and these staircases had numerous post holes bored into them.
Post holes for what?
The thinking is they were used for ropes, maybe wrapping ropes around wooden posts to act as pulleys, or some kind of rope-assisted hauling system to help drag heavy blocks up this surprisingly steep incline. It gave them a significant mechanical advantage.
So actual physical proof of Egyptians using sophisticated ramp and rope techniques to move heavy stones around the same time the Great Pyramid was built.
Exactly. It's really compelling evidence for how they could have lifted the blocks. It doesn't mean we know the exact Giza ramp setup, but it shows the technology existed and was in use.
That's huge. That really counters the "it was impossible" argument.
It does significantly. There are other less supported theories too, involving levers or maybe internal ramps, but the external ramp, especially with this Hatnub discovery, holds the most weight.
Now, von Däniken also talks about the precision, right? The stones fitting together so tightly, almost too perfectly. And there's that more controversial idea about geopolymer concrete.
Yes, the Davidis and Barsoom theory. It's definitely more on the fringe, but worth mentioning.
What's the core idea there?
Essentially, they proposed that maybe some of the pyramid blocks weren't purely quarried and carved natural stone, but were actually cast in place, like an early form of concrete made by mixing limestone rubble, binders like natron or kaolin, and water.
Cast like concrete blocks on the pyramid itself.
That's the hypothesis.
Yeah.
Proponents argue it could explain the incredibly tight joints between some blocks, hard to achieve consistently with just carving, and maybe why relatively few copper tools have been found right at the Giza site, compared to the immense amount of stone shaped.
Has this been tested?
Well, it's complicated. Standard geological analysis of samples usually identifies them as natural limestone from the Giza quarries. However, Michel Barsoom did perform microstructural analysis on some samples, and he found features like amorphous cementing phases, high water content, even nanoscale silica spheres that he argued are inconsistent with typical natural Giza limestone, suggesting maybe some kind of reconstitution or binding agent was involved.
So conflicting analyses.
Pretty much. It remains a very debated theory within geology and Egyptology. The vast majority of experts still favor the quarried block explanation, but it's out there as an alternative idea for explaining some of the precision.
Okay. So even with that debate, the main picture is still human effort. What about the workforce? Von Däniken implies it would need an impossibly huge number of people, maybe slaves working under brutal conditions.
Yeah, the image of slaves is persistent, but largely inaccurate according to the evidence. It was definitely a massive workforce, highly organized, skilled craftsmen, engineers, surveyors, stonemasons, plus huge numbers of laborers.
Where did they all come from?
Likely conscripted, possibly seasonally. During the annual Nile flood, farming wasn't possible, so the agricultural workforce could be redirected to state projects like pyramid building. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing much later, mentioned a figure of 100,000 men working for 20 years on the Great Pyramid.
100,000. Is that realistic?
Some modern Egyptologists think it's plausible, maybe representing rotating crews over that period, but the crucial point comes from archaeology near the pyramids. They've excavated extensive workers' villages.
What do those villages tell us?
They show these workers were state-employed, they were housed in organized barracks, they were fed lots of evidence for bread, fish, meat, they even received medical care. We find bones that were set and healed.
So not slaves at all.
No, not slaves in the way we usually think of them. They were a conscripted, state-supported labor force engaged in a national project, maybe even seen as a religious duty, a feat of organization as much as engineering.
That completely changes the picture from whipped slaves under alien overseers.
Completely. It highlights the incredible organizational capacity of the Old Kingdom Egyptian state.
Okay, so pyramids. Human ingenuity, massive organization, known techniques. Now, let's step back a bit. How does von Däniken even set up the idea of alien visitors in the first place in Chariots of the Gods? What's his starting point?
He really lays the groundwork in his very first chapter, which is titled, Are There Intelligent Beings in the Cosmos?
Catchy title.
It is, and his argument there is fundamentally statistical, based on the sheer vastness of the universe.
Right, the Drake equation kind of thinking.
Sort of along those lines, yeah. He talks about billions upon billions of stars, the high probability of planets orbiting many of them. And he argues that even using really conservative estimates for how many planets might be suitable for life and how many of those might actually develop intelligent life, the numbers still come out incredibly high. He basically says it's almost mathematically inevitable that extraterrestrial life exists somewhere.
Makes sense from a probability standpoint, I guess.
Yeah.
Does he bring in any science to back this up?
He tries to lend it some scientific weight. He mentions things like SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence.
Yeah.
He talks about possible interstellar communication methods like beaming radio signals with math or pictures encoded in them. He references space probes being developed.
So name-dropping current science of the time?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
He also mentions the field of exobiology, which studies the possibility of life beyond Earth, and name-checks reputable institutions like NASA and Caltech. It all serves to create this veneer of scientific plausibility for his core premise. Aliens are likely out there.
And didn't he use a quote from Willy Ley, the science writer, to really drive this home?
He did. Willy Ley was well known for his work on rocketry and space travel. Von Däniken includes this detailed calculation attributed to Ley.
What did it calculate?
It tried to estimate the number of inhabited planets just within our own Milky Way galaxy, even using what Ley considered conservative numbers back then for stars with planets, planets in the habitable zone, planets where life actually arises, planets with intelligent life, planets with civilizations lasting long enough.
Wow, lots of factors.
Yes. And even being conservative, Ley's calculation apparently arrived at a staggering number, potentially thousands, maybe many thousands, of inhabited worlds just in our galaxy.
Thousands.
That was the figure presented. And von Däniken adds that more recent star counts, even higher than Ley used, would make that number even bigger. So the probability, in his view, is overwhelming.
Okay, so he establishes this high probability of alien life existing somewhere, which then makes it seem more plausible, maybe, that they could have visited here in the past.
Exactly. It's the setup for everything that follows. If they're likely out there, then maybe they came here. And if they came here, maybe they were responsible for some of these ancient mysteries.
Right. So let's revisit some of those specific mysteries now, comparing his claim directly with the academic view. We did Giza, but let's quickly recap that one.
Okay. Giza pyramids. Von Däniken's position. Essentially impossible without alien tech. The transport, the lifting, the precision, the scale. He questions materials like wood for rollers being available.
And the academic consensus.
Skilled Egyptian workforce. Known techniques refined to an incredible degree. Quarrying with copper and stone tools. Transport via sledges on prepared causeways, possibly using water lubrication. Lifting via sophisticated ramp systems, evidenced by Hatnub, if not the exact Giza-designed precise surveying. And massive, state-sponsored, well-cared-for labor.
Key evidence against aliens.
Worker villages showing their status, the Red Sea papyri, like Mirror's diary detailing logistics, experimental archaeology showing feasibility, tool analysis, ramp theories backed by finds like Hatnub, and key figures supporting this are scholars like Lenner, Hawass, Talat, Edwards.
A whole field of Egyptology.
Okay, what about Palenque, the sarcophagus lid of Palata, the astronaut?
Von Däniken's take. Clearly an astronaut and rocket ship. He points to a figure reclining, hands on controls, maybe a helmet, flames, or exhaust coming out the bottom.
Looks kind of like that in isolation, maybe.
If you don't know the context, perhaps. But the academic consensus among Mayanists is completely different and very solid.
Which is?
It depicts the Maya ruler, Pakal the Great, at the moment of his death, or rather his transition. He's falling down the world tree, which von Däniken interprets as the rocket frame, into the jaws of the underworld monster, the Earth monster. But it's also about rebirth. He embodies the maize god who dies and is reborn, ensuring agricultural fertility.
So it's about death and rebirth, not space travel. Exactly. Every element von Däniken points to as technological has a well-understood meaning within Maya cosmology, iconography, and mythology. The controls are parts of the world tree, or symbolic gestures. The helmet is Pakal's hair or headdress. The exhaust is the roots of the world tree entering the underworld.
Key evidence against the astronaut.
Its complete consistency with countless other examples of Maya art, mythology, and writing about cosmology, the world tree, the celestial bird at the top, the earth monster below, the maize god cycle. It fits perfectly. Key scholars here include Linda Shelley, David Friedel, Alberto Ruiz-Lullier, who discovered the tomb, Merle Green Robertson. Decades of research confirmed the Mayan interpretation. Von Däniken just ignored all of it.
Okay, and the Piri-Reis map. The one supposedly showing Antarctica without ice.
Von Däniken's claim, following Charles Hapgood before him, it's an incredibly accurate map, possibly derived from ancient sources, showing the coast of Antarctica before it was covered by ice. This implies ancient advanced mapping, maybe even an aerial survey from space, potentially by aliens.
Sounds amazing if true. What's the reality?
The academic consensus among cartographic historians is quite different. It's a fragment of a world map drawn by the Ottoman admiral and cartographer Piri Reis in 1513. It's a portolan chart, a type of navigational map common then.
So 16th century, not ancient.
Yeah.
Where did he get his info?
He actually wrote on the map itself. He says he compiled it from about 20 older maps and charts, including maps captured from Spanish and Portuguese sailors, and specifically mentions maps drawn by Christopher Columbus.
Columbus. So contemporary sources, not ancient ones.
Mostly contemporary, yes. The southern landmass that von Däniken and Hapgood claim is ice-free Antarctica. Most experts identify it as a distorted depiction of the coast of South America, possibly Brazil and Patagonia, bent eastward to fit on the parchment. Or it might incorporate ideas about the hypothetical southern continent, Terra Australis Incognita, which mapmakers believed existed but hadn't actually seen.
So not Antarctica.
Highly unlikely. The map's own annotations for that southern land describe the climate as hot and the place inhabited by large snakes. That hardly sounds like Antarctica iced or not. Plus, the overall style, the known distortions typical of portolan charts trying to map large areas, the named sources. It all points to a 16th century compilation based on the exploration knowledge of that time. Hapgood's theories about ancient supercivilizations mapping the globe have been largely rejected by mainstream science.
Key evidence against the ancient Italian map idea.
The map's own date and stated sources, its clear portolan style, known cartographic distortions of the era, the annotations contradicting an Antarctic interpretation, the lack of evidence for Hapgood's underlying theories. Experts like Gregory McIntosh and George R. Deacon have studied it extensively and place it firmly in its 16th century context.
Okay, so we're seeing a real pattern here. Sensational claim versus detailed, context-based academic understanding. And the analysis sources we looked at also point out some fundamental issues with von Däniken's evidence and methods generally, right? Beyond these specific examples.
Absolutely. Critics have consistently highlighted, well, let's call them factual inaccuracies or misrepresentations.
Or what?
Things like his claims about the Iron Pillar in Delhi, its age, its supposed complete lack of rust, or misdating certain artifacts like samples of Inca cotton. His descriptions of the Nazca Lines, as we mentioned, weren't entirely accurate, and perhaps most notoriously, there were later accusations about a completely fabricated expedition to find metal plates in caves in Ecuador, the Cueva de los Tallos story.
Fabricated, wow.
That's been heavily disputed, let's say. There are entire books dedicated to debunking these sorts of factual errors in von Däniken's work, like Ronald Story's The Space Gods Revealed or Clifford Wilson's Crash Go the Chariots. They go point by point.
And beyond just factual errors, there's the logic he uses.
Yes, logical fallacies are frequent criticism. A big one is the argument from ignorance, meaning we don't fully understand exactly how X was done, therefore it must have been aliens. It assumes any gap in our current knowledge automatically proves the extraordinary claim.
Instead of just admitting we don't know everything yet.
Exactly. Another related one is the argument from personal incredulity. I personally find it hard to believe ancient people could do this, therefore aliens must have helped. It substitutes personal belief for evidence.
Okay.
There's also clear confirmation bias. He tends to highlight details that seem to fit his theory, even superficially, while ignoring or downplaying evidence that contradicts it. Like ignoring the entire context of Maya cosmology for the Palenque lead. He forces interpretations out of context. This uses analogies. These are hallmarks of what scholars often call pseudo-archaeology.
Pseudo-archaeology.
Yeah, people like John Cole or William Steven Jr. have characterized it by its tendency towards sensationalism, misuse of logic and evidence, misunderstanding the scientific method, often having internal contradictions, and lacking that self-correcting mechanism that real science has.
And there's a deeper, more serious criticism too, isn't there? About ethnocentrism or even racism.
This is a really significant point, yes. The implication, often unstated but definitely present, is that non-European ancient civilizations, Egyptians, Mayans, Nazca people, etc., weren't clever enough or capable enough to achieve these amazing things on their own.
So it must have been outside help, i.e. aliens?
That's the underlying message, critics argue. It diminishes the ingenuity, intelligence, and cultural achievements of these peoples. Archaeologist Kenneth Fetter has written extensively about this, calling ancient alien theories inherently dismissive, essentially robbing these cultures of their own heritage and accomplishments.
That's a powerful critique.
It really is. It contrasts sharply with, say, efforts to understand and respect indigenous origin stories on their own terms, like Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about.
Mm.
Those stories might involve sky beings or cosmic connections, but they arise from within the culture's worldview. They aren't imposed from outside with a modern technological lens.
Right, different things entirely. And weren't there also questions about originality, plagiarism accusations?
Yes, those surfaced too. He was accused of borrowing heavily, perhaps plagiarizing, from earlier French writers like Robert Charroux and Jacques Bergier and Louis Pauls, who wrote The Morning of the Magicians.
So the ideas weren't entirely new.
Many of the core concepts have been floating around in esoteric or science fiction circles for a while. Researcher Jason Colavito has even traced a lot of the specific motifs and ideas back to the fiction of H.P. Lovecraft from the early 20th century. And von Däniken didn't always clearly credit his precursors or inspirations.
Interesting. So maybe less original than it seemed at the time.
Perhaps. And tying all these criticisms together is that fundamental issue we keep coming back to: ignoring context.
Explain that again.
It's the basic mistake of taking an artifact, like the Planck lid, or a monument, like a pyramid, or a myth, out of its specific cultural, historical, and archaeological setting. You strip away its original meaning and context, and then you impose a modern interpretation onto it, usually based on a superficial visual resemblance or a misunderstanding, instead of doing the hard work of understanding the symbolic language, belief, and technology of the actual people who created it. That's probably the most fundamental flaw in the whole approach.
Okay, so Chariots clearly stirred up a lot of debate and criticism. Now, in the excerpts we have from von Däniken himself, responding later on, he does acknowledge some of this, right?
He certainly does. He talks about facing what he calls a warm rain of counterbooks after Chariots came out. He explicitly mentions the accusations plagiarism, being unscientific, anti-religious bias, being ignorant of the facts. He doesn't shy away from saying he was criticized.
Does he admit to any errors?
He does admit to some specific things. He mentions transmitting a false miracle about some jade, claiming it was from China when the context clearly pointed to Central America. He also acknowledges that a specific prediction he made about a Mars mission timetable in the book obviously didn't pan out as he'd written.
How does he explain making those mistakes?
He presents himself as having been a beginner at the time, someone who was maybe too trusting, overly enthusiastic, and perhaps relied too much on secondhand information or sources that were already outdated. That's his explanation for the factual errors.
But does he think those errors sink his whole theory?
No, he argues they don't. He maintains that while he made some mistakes, the fundamental ancient astronaut theory remains intact. He even mentions a colleague, Dr. Johannes Fiebag, who apparently collected examples defending von Däniken's work against specific refutations. So he's basically saying, okay, I got some details wrong, but the core idea is still valid.
And he pushes back against some critics directly, too. He mentions a Professor Wilhelmy.
Yes, Herbert Wilhelmy, who was a recognized expert on Mayan geography and culture. Von Däniken accuses Wilhelmy of making his own errors in his critique.
Like what?
He claims Wilhelmy cited outdated work and, interestingly, that Wilhelmy misrepresented von Däniken's own description of a specific Olmec monolith from Levanta.
How so? What was von Däniken's description?
Von Däniken describes this monolith in quite vivid technological terms. A figure sitting inside something like a snake or dragon, but with pedals, switchgear, levers, wearing a helmet with a microphone. Very suggestive of machinery. He implies Wilhelmy didn't accurately represent this description when arguing against it.
And Wilhelmy's interpretation would have been?
Based on Olmec iconography, likely something completely different. A ruler, a deity, a shaman, within a symbolic creature representing perhaps the earth or underworld, using standard Olmec artistic conventions, not pedals and switchgear.
So, a clash of interpretations again. Did he mention anything else about Wilhelmy?
Yes, the cenote at Chichen Itza, those natural sinkholes. Wilhelmy, as a geographer, explained them correctly as being formed by the collapse of underground limestone caverns, typical karst geology. Von Däniken seems to mock this explanation, accusing Wilhelmy of ignoring von Däniken's own. He calls it his crack-brained invention, that the cenotes were actually formed by meteorite impacts.
Meteorite impacts, that's
Yeah.
different.
It's certainly not the accepted geological explanation, but von Däniken uses it to portray the established academic as being dismissive of his supposedly brilliant alternative idea.
So despite all the criticism, he sounds pretty defiant in his response. Does he seem bitter?
He claims not to be embittered. He says he's learned from the criticism. He also makes a point of mentioning that there are pro-Däniken books and articles out there supporting him.
So he feels vindicated to some extent.
Perhaps. He does express some disappointment, though. He feels there's media prejudice against his ideas and complains about others borrowing his concepts without giving him credit. But overall, he frames his work as vital,
Vital how?
as a necessary challenge to what he sees as outdated worldviews. He calls for rethinking millennia-old beliefs, for rediscovering supposedly hidden knowledge. He even connects it to modern space travel, saying it gives us a new lens to understand the past.
And he has suggestions for how research should change.
Yeah, he gets quite radical there. He suggests modern labs and interdisciplinary scientists should basically take over archaeological research. He even urges priests and religious leaders to start doubting their established beliefs based on his ideas.
Wow, that's quite a call to action.
It is, and he finishes that response by doubling down on his core claim
Which is?
that the gods of antiquity were, in fact, extraterrestrial visitors, that they left countless traces behind. He admits we don't know exactly who they were, where they came from, but insists they were here. And he even throws in the provocative suggestion that maybe these visitors wiped out part of early humanity and directly intervened to produce Homo sapiens.
Goodness. Right back to the most sensational claims. So we've covered a lot of ground here. The claims, the evidence, the criticisms, his response.
We really have. It brings us full circle, doesn't it?
Right.
Back to why Chariots of the Gods caused such a stir, and frankly, why it still sparks so much interest and debate decades later.
It really does seem to have an enduring appeal. Why do you think that is, based on our sources?
I think our analysis points to that blend, doesn't it? It mixes this genuine sense of wonder about the past, about these incredible ancient achievements, with this appealing challenge to established narratives, to authority. It offers a simple, grand, exciting answer to complex questions. It taps into that deep human curiosity about our origins, about whether we're alone, the possibility that there's a bigger hidden story.
That's a powerful mix. But ultimately, as we've kind of explored throughout this deep dive, the real takeaway seems to be the importance of critical thinking, right?
Absolutely. The value lies in approaching any claim about the past, especially extraordinary ones, with a critical mindset, asking, what's the evidence? Is this interpretation logical? Does it fit the context?
Yeah.
Relying on evidence-based reasoning.
Because while the allure of a simple, sensational story is strong,
A careful look at the actual evidence, using the methods of archaeology, history, science, usually reveals a much more nuanced picture. And often, I'd argue, an even more fascinating story of human ingenuity, organization, and belief.
that's a great point. So a final thought then, perhaps for you, the learner. Considering just how powerfully a really compelling narrative can grab hold, even if the evidence supporting it is shaky, what other widely accepted ideas or truths out there might actually benefit from a deeper, more critical look?
That's something to ponder.
Definitely something to think about. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive today.